Long before most economists and commentators realized that we were headed toward the current economic crisis in the U.S. and globally, some were pointing elsewhere toward trouble on the horizon. The U.S.'s enormous debt, and specifically the amount we owe to China, was viewed as a bubble that could burst badly if China ever soured on us as an investment. That fear, as we all know now, was replaced by many other flaws and failures that have brought us to where we are today. But where do we stand in relationship to China? In his new book, Superfusion, Zachary Karabell argues that the economies of China and the United States have actually melded into each other. We've heard a lot about economies melting lately, but he's talking about this one melding into one economy, a hybrid economy. He calls it Chimerica. And so do China hands, the folks who follow China. It's developed under our noses, fueled by the flow of billions of dollars from the United States for Chinese-made goods, and then back in this country from China in exchange for IOUs. Zachary Karabell says that this mega economy, and I'm going to quote him now, he's hiding in plain sight, unrecognized, unacknowledged, and unwanted by many millions whose lives are being reshaped by it. He says, I'm not suggesting this intertwinement is an unalloyed good thing, but it's a fact. And it's better to deal with reality than to live in a fantasy world. Zachary Karabell is the president of River Twice Research, where he analyzes economic and political trends. He's also a senior advisor for Business for Social Responsibility, which develops sustainable business strategies. Previously, he was president of Fred Alger and Company and portfolio manager of their award-winning China-U.S. Growth Fund. He launched the $30 million Spectra Green Fund, linking profit and sustainability. Educated at Columbia, Oxford, and Harvard, he's the author of some other books, A Visionary Nation, 4 Centuries of American Dreams and What Lies Ahead, The Last Campaign, How Harry Truman Won the '48 Election, and Peace Be Upon You, the story of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish coexistence. So as you can get a sense, a pretty eclectic set of writings. His latest is this one, Superfusion, How China and America Became One Economy and Why the World's Prosperity Depends on It. Welcome, Zachary Karabell.
Thank you so much.
I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we're going to talk about. And as just talking about your books and your work, in investments, but not just that, deeper things and so on, you've led a pretty varied life. Briefly, what is your path? How do you see your path to the work that you're doing today?
It's a good question, one which I have both been asked and asked myself. But I think it really amounts to I'm someone who believes that ideas matter and that they shape the world that we're living in pretty fundamentally. And oddly enough, having spent a pretty considerable number of years on Wall Street investing, and even though some of those investments, I guess, were more progressive in nature, it still was the world of capital. Most of what goes on in that world is driven by ideas and frameworks about how people think the world is working and how it's going to work, and some of which we know also based on some understanding of how the world has worked or some misunderstanding of how the world has worked, as the case may be.
Yeah.
And that ideas also drive books and writing, obviously. And one of the things I tried to do in this book, Superfusion, is point out that there is essentially an emerging system that we haven't really fully gotten our hands around, that we haven't really almost recognized, and that there is a driving force here that I guess for lack of a better word, our consciousness of it hasn't caught up to the reality of it yet.
And that is this melding of these two economies. Now, I mean, it seems to me people have looked for years at A, how much Chinese goods we consume, and B, how many IOUs, bonds, and so on they invest in. But you're saying that takes that information, that evidence, to another level.
Yeah, and again, I think you're totally right, particularly in the past year, but to some degree over the past 4 or 5 years, beginning with John Kerry's presidential campaign, where he talked about Benedict Arnold CEOs and was very, I think clearly, if not explicitly, having in mind the leaders of large American multinational companies that were outsourcing jobs, especially to China, although, as we know, some of those jobs went to India at all. And as I point out in the book, I actually think that's, while true, right? I mean, no one would deny that China has become a major source of lower-cost manufacturing, and in the past few years, a major source of increasingly higher-end manufacturing. Most of the personal PDAs that people have, the BlackBerries, the cell phones, the computers, most of those things are made in China as well. So it's not just cheap goods sold at Walmart. It's also more higher-end.
For those listeners who either remember it or don't, there was a similar transition at one point in what you just described with Japan.
Yeah, and there's a similar transition with Mexico. I mean, the point is, the United States manufacturing base has been eroding or moving away from America toward lower-cost production for 30 years. China is the latest chapter in that movement, but it is hardly as if before China became that source of lower-cost production that American manufacturing was thriving.
Right, exactly.
And, the 1970s, I mean, listen to any Bruce Springsteen song about the erosion of the Rust Belt, and that happened in the 1970s.
Yeah, and I was also saying specifically how at first in the maybe the late 50s, early 60s, Japanese products were sort of looked down on. That's where you got a cheap transistor radio, and of course we saw what happened. I mean, we now drive our Lexuses and our hybrids and top goods in the world.
And they moved up the value chain.
Exactly, and that's exactly what's happening with China right now.
But and people understand that China owns about $1 trillion of our debt. I think people are aware of that fact, if not the specific number, certainly, that we owe China money. But first of all, there's an obvious point there, which is we owe them money that we exported to them in the first place. It's not as if Chinese business people woke up one day and went, wow, I think we have this great insight into what the American consumer wants, and we're going to produce it and get wealthy. It was largely American companies going to China, setting up shop, producing the same sorts of things they had been producing, and then reselling them. And China wouldn't have had this money otherwise. I mean, in some sense, the money they're lending us is money we spent. And that may be an obvious reality, but I don't think it's so obvious in fact. And think about one other aspect of this. If we hadn't, weirdly enough, exported that capital to China in the past couple of years, $1 trillion, $2 trillion, whatever it was, and if that had been invested in the U.S. financial system or in financial instruments linked to the U.S. housing market, that $1 trillion would have been $400 billion. And it probably wouldn't have been liquid, and we probably wouldn't then have been able to spend what we have spent over the past year in order to sustain or refinance our financial system.
Very interesting. Great. And in other words, you're saying, that we were buying products from elsewhere rather than the way money was being spent in this country. And so much of it, the huge shift in this economy from manufacturing to services, but not just to services, to the financial sector. A lot of folks have written about that, how the financial sector has gone to where it is now a huge proportion of our economy. And as you say, that is the part that has been burned really bad. Your book basically tells people, look, behind those maybe two big obvious facts, there's something else going on.
And there's another aspect which gets much less attention, which is that a huge portion of China's economic growth story over the past 20 years, and it is an incredible economic growth story. Chinese, when they get defensive, when they are criticized about human rights or about the political system, and we can get to whether, what the nature of those critiques are, often say, look, in the past 20 years, we as a society, and to some degree the Communist Party, which in many ways is the party formerly known as communist, have brought hundreds of millions of people out of really dire agrarian poverty and integrated them into a much more materially stable, semi-middle-class existence. And that's absolutely true. And by the way, economic rights are part of the UN Declaration of Human Rights along with social and political. So the Chinese can legitimately say, look, we have a mixed record on human rights, not a completely. I mean, there is
some sense in which they can describe what you just said as being that they've done more for.
Right, and we could certainly have a serious, and I think should have a serious argument about whether that's a legitimate comeback.
Mm-hmm.
One right doesn't justify one wrong, but they say, look, we've done this. What I try to show in the book is that economic evolution of China over the past 20 years would have been almost impossible had China not actively integrated itself with the U.S. economy, wooed U.S. businesses, and attracted American capital. And since 1989, and a lot of this is post-Tiananmen Square, where the Chinese leadership made a very clear decision of, we will have no political reform because we don't want to end up like the Soviet Union, but we'll have hypercharged economic reform. And if you're going to have hypercharged economic reform, what do? You tether your wagon to what has been the most dominant global economy, namely the United States. And for the next 20 years, China attracts hundreds of billions, if not probably more like trillions of dollars of U.S. investment capital in China, as well as American know-how about how to transform an economy, some of which may be quite flawed, but a lot of which was quite constructive. So part of this story is that the China economy story is very much also an American economy story.
So it's very clear that you don't subscribe to an us versus them, a U.S. versus China point of view. For the sake of this conversation, who does and what do they say?
Well, I think most people in both countries, as in most popular sentiment in both China and the United States, is still, as tends to be the case, pretty nationalist, meaning we view ourselves as Americans, they view themselves as Chinese. We view our system as being, to some degree, a zero-sum relative to other parts of the world, and that our prosperity, to some degree, entails other people, if not doing a little worse, then certainly other people not doing a lot better. And there's, I think, a fear that there's only so much economic growth to go around, and if they have more of it, we have less of it. And the Chinese have that sentiment as well. Plus, sentiment in China has hundreds of years of suspicion of the West and the belief that the United States, having been deeply anti-communist and somewhat anti-Chinese, is simply looking for a way to actually steal from China.
Mm-hmm. And
Americans clearly are deeply concerned that China is basically flooding the United States with not only low-cost goods, but goods of dubious quality, potentially dangerous, drywall, metallic toys.
Dog food, kids' toys, those sorts of things. Let me ask you one thing. It's my sense that both of these countries, as much as any other in the world, have a sense of exceptionalism.
Right. And I think that's absolutely right. And therefore, when two exceptionalisms combine, it's a pretty combustible mix. And when I say these economies have fused, I think one example that's similar, not identical, just similar, would be the European Union, where a bunch of countries decided and was somewhat validated by public sentiment that their future prosperity would be better secured by giving up some of their national sovereignty and working as one economic unit than by staying separate. And to some degree, what's happened between China and the United States is a little bit like the European Union, but with nobody ever wanting it, intending it, or knowing it.
And not saying it out loud.
And that's, I think, a real problem when it comes to popular sentiment, because it can leave a lot of people feeling, and I think legitimately feeling, like their economic fortune and fate is being determined by entities and systems over which they have no control and no say.
Mm-hmm.
And
you're saying that applies
for backlash.
You're saying that applies to both sides.
Yes.
Yeah. And again, we have two sides who feel they are, in certain ways preeminent. And whether it's China with its long-term view and its view that it is on the ascendant, or the U.S., it's certainly since World War II thinking it is the top dog in things. That I think one of the most interesting things you say is that it happened akin to the European Union, but certainly without it being spoken out front. But do you think also even without the rational intention?
Yes, no, I do. I think, from the U.S. side, there was a multi-year push toward more free trade, toward opening markets, toward integrating China, which included China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, an event which I say in the book was hugely consequential for the future shape of the global system, but got very much less press at the time because that was right after 9/11. It was right as we were invading Afghanistan, and so, an economic agreement, even with China, wasn't nearly as dramatic or seemingly important at the time. I actually think that this economic fusion is going to be more important to shaping the domestic life of Americans, Chinese, and the world, frankly, than much of the proximate threats that we focused on, whether it's Afghanistan or Islamic fundamentalism or, Iran and proliferation. I'm not suggesting those aren't issues. I just don't actually think that they will have nearly the same kind of effect on our lives that the rise of China does.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think we need to be increasingly sensitive to.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. How has our economic relationship with China affected the current economic crisis for either side?
So in the book, and part of the point of naming it superfusion was to say that these are the two most dominant economies in the world. China definitely in the ascendant, but the United States, even with its issues, remains pretty much the largest economic bloc and certainly one of the most important.
The work I've looked at over the last few years says that actually in terms of size and a few other things, the European Union...
You're absolutely right. The European Union in totality is larger as an economic bloc than the United States, but the European Union is still far less integrated than the United States as an economy.
Very good.
And I suppose if you were to take that further and at one point add the U.S. economy to the Chinese in a bigger bloc, but we're not doing that.
Okay.
I believe that the crisis of the past year would have been significantly worse in the absence of this intimate interaction between China and the United States. One, because the relationship over the past 15 years, some people say, created huge economic imbalances because China built up these trillions of dollars of reserves and the United States slowly went into debt. It's also true, though, that the way capital shifted, and because China has this odd hybrid closed economic system, it basically was saved up a lot of capital that became a very healthy reserve both for the United States and for China itself. China wouldn't have been able to spend its own stimulus package of $600 billion and then another $1 trillion in loans had it not been for the trade relationship with the United States.
In other words, what you're saying is that because I think it's easier for us to see how, of course, we sold bonds to put out some of this money, and they were our biggest customer. So it's pretty easy to see how but what you're saying is that they wouldn't have had the wealth they had if we hadn't been buying all their products.
Right. Now, of course, that then leads to many people in the United States going, you see, that's kind of the proof of we're giving away the store to enrich China. And there is an element in which that's true, meaning our ability to continue to become as affluent on aggregate is probably going to level off. And also because we have such internal issues of we may be very affluent in aggregate, but we hardly are affluent in particular, meaning, you know, there are a few million people who are incredibly wealthy, there are 50 million people who are incredibly poor. It's not like the United States is a smoothly affluent society.
Right, and as people who listen to this show know, that inequality is growing and is as great as it's ever been in this country.
Right, and I think, you know, some of those people are also going to feel like the China relationship is essentially one that facilitates the enrichment of multinational companies and their leaders. And to some degree, that's actually true. The problem with the critique is that this process is also leading to the enrichment of hundreds of millions of people in China, slowly hundreds of millions of people in India and Brazil and elsewhere. And their level of confidence and conviction that they're on a path that will help them write the script for the future of the world in the 21st century is not going to be undermined by a capitalist critique saying that this is all just helping, you know, the leaders of Procter & Gamble. There's a process underway here that is in fact leading to a vast number of people in a very rapid amount of time changing their material circumstances almost entirely for the better. And we can get to the environmental issues that creates and all the problems that generates, because nothing is an unalloyed good. But I just don't feel that the critique, let's say the capitalist critique of this, does much good in getting to the root of this is still happening in a way that is largely beneficial for a huge number of people around the globe and hugely challenging for the United States, which has been a disproportionate winner in the global economy for the past 50, 60 years.
Yeah, very good. Let me just ask quickly how this fusion relationship between the U.S. and China affects, let me give you three, India, Japan, the European Union.
Right. So Japan, it affects profoundly because the only growth Japan has in its economy now is by exporting higher-end equipment and materials to China that China doesn't currently produce. You know, China, as you said before, is moving up the chain of the sophistication, but it still doesn't make certain types of high-end steel. It still doesn't make certain types of power generation equipment or even earth movers. So, you know, Japan exports Komatsu earth movers, which are their equivalent of our Caterpillar equipment. And it's basically going to sink or swim based on the robustness of China's growth. India is a very different story. If China's path for the past 20 years has been we will build infrastructure first and we will direct our economy toward an export economy to generate income and then slowly focus on building up a domestic consumption economy, India has had sort of the reverse, which is we will build up a domestic consumption economy and then eventually we'll get to infrastructure and we'll get to integration with the global economy. So India is sort of an inward story that will eventually go out, and China is a sort of top-down story that will eventually go up. But that means India is much less important for the global system, even though it's very important for India and could be. And your last country was the European Union. Or the last bloc.
Yeah.
I think the EU is in a deeply challenging position in that it's pseudo-post-capitalist, meaning it has a high social safety net, it has unfavorable demographics, and it has an ability to generate a high level of kind of affluence internally, but not a lot of dynamism externally. And China has begun to undercut. We've heard about cottage industries in Italy and manufacturing in Germany. So China does represent a threat there. But the EU is a little more insulated because it's its own bloc. And I think for the next 5 to 10 years, the rise of China isn't likely to have the same sort of tectonic effect on the domestic world of the EU that it does on the United States.
Okay. I'm Terrence McNally, and the voice you hear is Zachary Karabell. We're talking about superfusion, how China America became one economy, and his website is RiverTwice. That's one word, rivertwice.com. If you were advising the Obama administration or economic players, what would you advise them in terms of how to relate to this superfused economy, how to relate to China over the next few years?
Yeah, it's a very good question also because Obama will be making a major state visit to China on November 15th and November 16th, which will be his first foray into this. A lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the noise, as it were, coming out of the Obama administration from Secretary Timothy Geithner to the Energy Secretary Henry Chu has been very positive about recognizing that China is an economic force to be grappled with, that it's not one that we can browbeat, it's not one we can strong-arm, and the Chinese as well certainly recognize that the health of the U.S. economy is pretty vital to China. After all, China has these huge investments in America, and in U.S. dollars, they certainly can't afford to see the United States dwindle because that would do them a lot of harm as
That's
well.
right. You don't want your best customer going bankrupt.
Exactly. So, I think both governments are speaking very constructively, and that's a good sign for the future. I think what neither government really grapples with is the degree to which economic systems and the flow of capital has a way of undermining the ability of governments to control things. And governments like to control things. It's kind of what they're in the business of doing. And I don't think either government, frankly, is all that prepared for the ways in which this fusion can undermine their ability to have sovereignty, whether it's the United States over interest rates, whether it's the long-term value of the dollar, whether it's just patterns of trade, and we see some of that today about American workers. And China has its own, China doesn't want people talking about Tibet. They don't want people basically saying anything about them internally. So I think both governments are going to face that challenge. And I guess my caution would be if I were speaking to Obama, that you have to start to be prepared for either closer integration or a little more bewilderment, because they're just things you're not going to be able to control the degree to which you want to.
I've read that even that, not just specifically China, but China was a big piece of it, that some of the things that the Fed was trying to do using old tools to try to handle the economy prior to this collapse were just not working because of the integration of the U.S. economy into so many others, so that like tinkering with an interest rate just couldn't have the effect it used to have, and that Greenspan was pretty slow, if ever, to recognize that.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. But I think governments and bureaucracies are very slow to recognize that because they're focused on their turf and they're focused on their tools. And, it's easy for me to sit here and say, well, you should be prepared to be in a world where you have less control. Great. That's not exactly something that bureaucrats want to hear.
Yeah,
but,
especially as we said at the top of these exceptionalist governments.
Right, but I think that's really the message. And frankly, if you wanted to advance the needle more in these very high-level discussions between finance ministers and all of it, you would bring in other players in the system. You'd bring in the leaders of companies. You'd bring in some more of the NGO community that's focused on alternative energy or focused on the environment, and you would recognize that, frankly, a lot of change is going to come from multiple actors and not just governments. But that's a big stretch for governments to make.
I know that the green economy, green tech, sustainability are big issues to you, big things in the way you look at the world and what you're trying to do with your work. What are you engaged with right now, and what gives you your biggest fears and your biggest hopes in that regard?
Yeah, I think the biggest fear I have, or the biggest fears are twofold. One is that people will continue to underestimate the ability of China to grow rapidly, and that what that will lead to, in a very specific sense, is an underestimation of the supply and demand dynamics of really vital raw material inputs, from oil to iron ore to zinc, and basically that we're underestimating just how expensive this stuff could become based purely on the fact that China may grow more quickly than we anticipate. And that has a lot of domestic ramifications. I mean, if you thought $145 a barrel of oil was a problem a year ago, what happens when it's $250? Now, there are people in the environmental community who think that legitimately, unless the price of oil reaches a really punitive level, it's hard to make a systemic shift away from it. And I think there's some virtue to that statement, but it sure is going to be painful in the process, regardless of how important that's going to be as a way of getting us off of our addiction.
Right.
And that does concern me. So, I mean, I think those are the things that I think we remain unprepared for, as well as the fact that because of the changes in the global economic system, the belief that with economic growth picking up, the jobs that have been lost will be returned somehow, that there's going to be this massive amount of corporate hiring, I just don't see happening in the near or middle term, or perhaps at all. If you're a company that can either make what you make elsewhere for less money than you make it here, and that's, I think, not just corporate capital, that's also people want stuff more cheaply. Or if you can do it more efficiently with technology, you don't need to hire the same level of people. And so I think we've got a real hard road to haul domestically for the United States in the years ahead.
And what about how we are doing or how other countries are doing in terms of, in other words, if there were another possible silver lining to the crash that's happened, is that rather than reconstructing the same way, that we could have two possible outcomes. One would be, and this is the one I'm less optimistic about, is a shift away from such a huge dependence on the financial sector and such a huge abdication to the financial sector. That's one. And the other is that actually that the money, instead of going back into the same old, goes into greener and cleaner things. I mean, just to think about, jobs being, I would say, our biggest issue right now, that as Van Jones has said in his books and was saying in the administration before he resigned, that you can't retrofit in China or India, that there's things that we need to do that could be very good for this economy.
Yeah, and also that we still have an ability to innovate and create, particularly in parts of California, that remain unrivaled. I mean, we are able to invent and create new ways of doing things, and the Chinese are essentially not even focused on that.
They fulfill, they will manufacture, they will find a way to deliver what results from innovations elsewhere.
Exactly, and that's where they are, just like you would have said about the United States in the 1880s. We were not focused on creating new stuff. We were focused on building cheaper wheels, not reinventing it. But all of what you say, while I think is certainly true observationally, it's equally true observationally that we seem to lack either the political ability or the cultural will to turn the urgency of the moment into action. And, that's a kind of an indictment of who we are culturally right now more than it is anything else, because you can say, hey, we could spend all this money on infrastructure. We could spend this money on reinventing some of what we do in a more efficient, more energy-efficient fashion that would also create jobs. But we seem so far away from doing that it's not even like a political statement. There's no bill that even replicates that. There's no agenda. I mean, healthcare is important, clearly. So,
well, now some people have said, and I agree with you, but some people have said that the stimulus bill, although not sold as such, was the greatest investment in clean energy and clean technology that the U.S. has ever done.
It was. But it's still in the tens of billions of dollars in an economy that is upwards of $14 trillion. So, if you're talking about really significant investment, I mean, China will spend $200 billion on alternative energy in the next few years, and that's 5% of its GDP. An equivalent amount for the United States would be $800 billion. So, no one's talking about $800 billion in clean energy and alternative energy spent by the government alone in the United States.
I think we'll close on this, Zachary. So your feeling is that it's pretty clear what needs to be done, and that we don't have the culture, the will, or even the constituencies that seem to be, because you would hope, I mean, as Lester Brown says and has been saying for so many years in his latest book, Plan B 4.0, we need like a wartime mobilization. When Roosevelt brought the automakers in and said, you're going to make planes and ships now, we need that similar kind of thing, and it just isn't happening.
And that's right. And I think what's unfortunate about that is that we remain on aggregate wealthy enough to do these things. However badly we distribute that internally, we actually do have the resources, but we are not adequately using them. And I think in face of a country like China, which granted has the advantage of being autocratic and they don't have a messy democratic process. They have a very messy system, by the way. They just don't have a messy democratic process. Right. They're more effective at transforming cultural urgency into cultural action right now. Mm-hmm. And that's simply an observation of where things are historically. And I'm certainly concerned over the next decades that if nothing happens to change that, that we will certainly be increasingly at a disadvantage in relation to that. Yeah, that the good things that need to happen will happen, but they won't happen here. Right. Okay. The book is Superfusion, How China and America Became One Economy. The website is rivertwice1word.com. Thank you, Zachary Karabell. Keep up the good work.